the door in terms of keeping Unity up to date. And this is probably like a minor thing that, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but like it seemed like at least once a week, Unity was prompting me to update to the latest version, which is a multi-gigabyte download. It takes forever. And then things would break in my project like every time. And it's like a simple mobile game project. It's like, I really wanted to keep this up to date because I just, I don't know. I just wanted to have the newest features. I was already close to being up to date. Let's just try to make that effort. That drove me nuts.
Yeah. You know the trick to that is?
Never update it.
Don't update it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a simple solution, I'm sure. Yeah.
No, but it's I'm being tongue in cheek. It sucks that that's true, but it is true. Like Twisted Tower, we're going to launch that game with Unity 2022. I'm not updating that thing. Everyone's like, update to Unity 6. Come on, Thomas, what are you doing? I'm like, the whole thing will explode if I do that.
Exactly, it will.
And even worse, I've done it. I did update to Unity 6. It's all the stuff on the surface looks fine. And then you try and play the full game, and there's like a billion small things that you're like, wait, what? How did that happen? Yeah. Why is that texture pink? What just happened? And it's all this little stuff that you could easily miss. You're spinning the chamber, Yeah. So I just keep it as is. And you're right. The update size downloads, the size of the update is huge. I'll say this. One of the issues with all these updates is you might get an update to one of the render pipelines and but the problem with all the render pipelines is there's 3 render pipelines. And then inside of each render pipeline is forward and then deferred. And then there's forward plus, and there's all these different quality settings. It's like nested rendering. Pipelines. I don't even know how to describe it. It is a mess. And is Godot that way? Does Godot have a bunch of different render pipelines? And
to my knowledge, no. I mean, I have a selector in the top right for forward plus, mobile, and compatibility. Those are my 3 options, and they're pretty clearly defined in the documentation what they do, and I'm pretty grateful for that. So,
but it's not really a 3D engine, is it?
So it has a Vulkan backend as of Godot 4. Like I said, I'm not much of a 3D person yet, but they're striving to kind of work towards that. They've got the Vulkan renderer now, and I think in Godot 4 as well, they did a bunch of work on like the global illumination system. So they're working towards that. But what you said was going to be like my next point for Unity. It's like, and maybe you can tell me if this is just a few examples of this, but it always felt like there was more than one official way to do something. Am I wrong? Because like it's multiple rendering pipelines, it's multiple input managers, like I don't know.
When everything is official, nothing's official.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. It's so frustrating. And I'll be the first to admit, I will use Unity probably until it dies, because it's the same reason why like I drove stick shift for years. It's like I just knew how to do it. That's how I knew. That's just what I knew. And you just get used to it. But it is way too heavy. And to your point, everything has an official, and then they tell you stuff. I was just griping with David Whaley about this on Discord. It's like they say one thing, dynamic batching is the greatest thing ever, dynamic batching, and then you try and do it and it doesn't work at all. Yeah. The way it was explained, but sometimes it does work and sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it's what it is it's just too complex. It's a bloated engine. So yes, that I agree with you about the documentation or the official way to do things.
Yeah. So. I mean, and apart from all that, it's like I'm making simple little 2D games. There's just so much of Unity that I never touched. And that hit me every time I was downloading a multi-gigabyte update, right? It's like, I'm not using so much of this stuff. Like, can I simplify? And Godot's answer to that.
It reminds me of an infomercial where they're like, you get the spaghetti grate or the cheese grater, but you also get the what are we going to say here? Some random thing that is also for the attachment to spin it. And then you also get the backpack to store it in.
Imagine you go into a medieval city for the first time. Maybe you're a peasant, you've spent most of your life living in a village. The sounds of the city, the scale of it, the busyness of it must have been amazing. You're going to have the metalworkers hammering away. You're going to have the cries of the pie sellers and the peascod hucksters. You're going to have the smell of animals. You're going to have the smell of horse dung on the street and oxen dung. You're going to have the noise of wheels. You're going to have everybody crowded together in an incredibly complex and busy environment. If the wind's in the wrong direction, you're going to smell the tanneries as well and their stench. Everything is going to be very different. But there is one thing all of those people that work in a medieval city have in common. What is it? Busy working men and women were the lifeblood of the growing urban economy in medieval England, and by the 12th and 13th century it's almost certain you would have been a member of a guild, a specific craft guild for the job you were doing. Those guilds provided a monopoly in that local area to the people that were part of it. Guilds were much more than just trade associations. They were the lifeblood of many aspects of medieval urban life. Historically, guilds form into two broad categories. You had the craft guilds, the people that made things out of raw materials, and you also had the mercantile guilds, basically the guilds of merchants that sold finished goods. Craft guilds came in all sorts of flavours. There were dyers, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, hatters, purse makers, girdlers, fishmongers, goldsmiths. Any trade you could think of was represented by a guild, and some of the guilds actually were very small parts of it. So if you were a blacksmith and you were making armour for somebody and that person wanted it gilded, well, you needed to give that armour to the goldsmiths guild to get the decoration put on it. There were some unusual guilds in the medieval period. Gong farmers, for example, those people who euphemistically took out the night soil, the human waste of a night. They took it away. Initially it was sold to farmers and spread on the land, so it had a certain value. They would also empty cesspits. They were the ones that were allowed to empty the cesspits. And we know that a lot of cesspits overflowing caused quite a lot of court cases, because we have records of a lot of court cases of dangerous cesspits. Occasionally the noxious fumes caused them to die as well, so it wasn't without risk. The gong farmers actually, strangely enough, became very wealthy as a guild, because in the later medieval period, the raw material for gunpowder was sourced from, amongst other things, human waste. Along with the gong farmers, there are some other unusual guilds. There were the girdlers, for example, who made all kinds of belts. There were also the scriveners. These were professional writers. Now, it's plausible that most people could write and read, at least partly, in the urban medieval environment. Maybe not the poorest people, but lots of people could read and write, but not necessarily very well, and not well enough to make presentable documents. So scriveners' tasks were often to dictate letters in a slightly formal way, to put things down for the courts, for example, and just to write nice letters in good handwriting to be sent to somebody else. Quite where the trope of adventurers guilds or thief guilds comes into it, beloved of fantasy novels. I don't think I've come across anything like that in the historical record. However, there is a fighters guild. There appears to be an Anglo-Saxon, a few Anglo-Saxon documents, I think called a frith guild or a knighten guild, which seems to be an organisation, a sort of brotherhood of fighting men. So that's plausible. The concept of the guild is not medieval. It goes back a lot earlier than that. We have records from ancient Rome of things called collegia, which are associations, trade associations. They seem to have died out post-Roman in what used to be known as the Dark Ages or the early medieval period. We don't really hear much about trade guilds as such, or towns and cities, possibly because there wasn't much trade. But they really come into their own later on, and they still exist, of course. Guilds are still a thing today. So what did guilds actually do? Well, they managed and regulated a specific trade in a specific area. They were a legal monopoly with all the good and bad things that could be associated with that. Typically, guilds organised the trade. They controlled prices. Controlled prices were a big thing in the medieval period. Inflation was simply controlled by not allowing prices to go up, apart from in very specific circumstances. For example, beer brewing was a set price unless the raw material barley prices had gone up. And then they could put the prices up a little bit. But broadly speaking, you knew what you had to pay for a certain thing in a certain way. Theoretically, they controlled the quality as well. And they had an organisation which restricted foreigners, and by foreigner I mean somebody not from the local area, so not from another country, but from the local area. They restricted foreigners doing trade that was competitive as well, in some cases banning it outright, or in other cases charging an extra tax on those foreigners doing business in the local area. It's a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective. There wasn't really a free market in the same way, and guilds prevented that very much. They controlled the market in certain goods and services. Guilds played a very significant role in society in medieval towns and cities. They provided welfare for members that had fallen on hard times. They also generated social events, and the senior guild members actually became amongst the top non-noble members of society. The Council of Guild members was incredibly powerful and negotiated directly with the top nobles or even with the king. Nobody could cross the guilds and get away with it. Guilds contributed to the broad social life of a town or city. They put on festivals, they provided events, they often rented their rooms out to the local people for events. And they seemed to take their civic responsibilities very seriously indeed. Medieval guilds were very hierarchically structured, as you can imagine. Most things in the medieval period were. They were usually run by a group of senior, experienced craftspeople, usually men, called wardens in some cases. They had lots of different names. Their job was to manage the guild, but also manage the quality of the output of the guild members. They were there to ensure that the guild's good name was maintained amongst the general population. They were also there to adjudicate disputes between guild members, to supervise the training of new people that were entering into the guild, and to have a role in the social life of the town or city, and to negotiate with the noble powers of the day. Not all guilds were incredibly powerful. Some were very small and very minor, although they were probably important locally. But some guilds, especially the mercantile guilds, became as powerful as city-states. They became nations in their own right and had armies. And they dealt with kings and emperors as equals. The first rung of guild membership was the apprentice. These were usually boys or young men, certainly somebody in their early teens, who was apprenticed to a master in their workshop. They didn't get paid. They did get food and lodging though, which is not to be underestimated in the medieval period. I mean, being housed and being fed were crucially important. The guild master's job was to teach the apprentice the skills of the job. These tasks often were very menial to begin with. Part of the job, probably for an early apprentice, was just to watch what was going on and probably sweep up at the end of the day. They were occasionally treated badly, although there were standards for treatment and types of food they had to eat, for example, but I'm sure there were abuses that went on. But broadly speaking, it was considered to be very lucky to be apprenticed to a guild master, whatever that guild would be. Maybe gong farmers were not so popular, but maybe they were. They were wealthy and powerful, and that was meaningful in the medieval period. Apprenticeships typically were for a set
Bye.